And we've been looking at fruits of the Spirit this past winter at Derry. And we're at our last fruit of the Spirit, and that's the fruit of self-control. We don't really think about that one as much. Things like kindness and gentleness and all that kind of gets more play. We don't often think about self-control, but it may be one of the most important ones, because so many things can turn in a moment in a loss of self-control. For Bruce Banner, a.k.a. the Hulk, self-control is more than a spiritual practice. It could be a matter of life and death, because his emotions could cause him to lose control. And if he lost himself in anger or jealousy, he would literally lose himself and turn into the Hulk. Now, we may not turn into a giant green creature, but we can sometimes turn into someone we don't want to be when we lose control, when our emotions get the best of us. Have you ever lost control in the moment, said something you regret, acted in a way that wasn't kind? Adults do it. Kids do it. Have you ever seen a child throw a tantrum for what seems like the most ridiculous reason in the world, but to them it's just everything, and they break down? I've seen it in kids. I've seen it in adults. I've seen it in myself. A loss of self-control can wreck relationships, jobs, treaties, peace, lives. We all struggle to be open to receive and nurture the various gifts of the Spirit. Certainly, self-control is one of the most challenging. At the same time, self-control gives us a clear avenue to fulfill our calling to be faithful servants of Jesus Christ. Self-control is the capacity to master the self, to restrain our needs, desires, emotions, and actions in order to obtain a greater good, a higher purpose, to maybe let something lie for a moment, a slight, an anger, an injustice, a feeling, in order to achieve God's purpose in our lives. On the one hand, it's the gift of the Spirit. On the other hand, it's a discipline to master. Do you remember the story of Cain and Abel in the Scriptures? Cain and Abel are brothers, and they both bring an offering to God. And for whatever reason, we don't know why, God likes Abel's offering more. It was like steak, and Cain's was like squash casserole. I get where God's coming from. I don't know. Other people may disagree, but we don't really know why. It never says why God accepted Abel's offering and rejects Cain. So maybe Cain had a right to be angry. Maybe Cain had every right to complain to God. Maybe he had a legitimate case. But in the moment, he lost self-control and killed his own brother. Self-control, lives hang in the balance. Maybe you remember the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. He's a talented young man, but he's foolish enough to tell his brothers that he will one day rule over them. He's a favorite of his father's, but he's kind of detested by his brothers. Dressed in a long-sleeve robe, we get the impression that he's spoiled and does not have to share in his brother's work. So one day his father sends Joseph to check on his brothers who are far away tending the sheep. His brothers decide to kill him, as you do, I guess, but at the last minute they sell him into slavery and he ends up in Egypt. In Egypt, Joseph's story takes dramatic ups and downs. Eventually, Pharaoh puts him in charge of the state to store up grain during 7 years of harvest, which will be followed by 7 years of famine. All those years, Joseph waits. He waits for it. He could have fallen into despair, given into temptation, languished in prison, clung on to bitterness, nursed his anger, sought revenge. Instead, he restrains himself. He has a sense that there is a larger purpose for his life, a divine hand at work even in the betrayals, the dangers, the schemes of others. He never gives up his trust in God. The famine ends up driving his brothers to Egypt in search of grain. And at first, Joseph hides his identity, puts his brothers through several tests. He restrains his emotions until he cannot contain himself any longer. He reveals his identity to his brothers. Releasing his emotions, he declares, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life, to keep alive for you and many survivors." Later, Joseph says, "Even though you intended it for harm, God intended it for good." Joseph learned to master himself so that he might serve the purposes of God. The Spirit instills self-control in our hearts so that we might use our gifts to serve God. Dwight D. Eisenhower grew up in a modest home in Abilene, Kansas. He was one of 7 brothers. He had a serious problem controlling his temper. When he was 10 years old, he was not allowed to go trick-or-treating with his older brothers. He flew into an uncontrollable rage, beating his fists against a tree until he tore off the flesh from his knuckles. His father whipped him with a hickory stitch, as you do, I guess, and sent him to bed sobbing. Later, his mother came into the room and suddenly rocked him in a chair next to his bed. After a long while, she said, "He that conquers his own soul is as great as he who conquers a city." It's a paraphrase of Proverbs 16:32. She told him the futility of anger and the self-destructive power of anger. For the rest of his life, Ike remembered that moment and those words. The experience helped him throughout his life to control his anger. A part of spiritual growth is learning self-control, learning when to let go and when to take hold, learning how to sacrifice less important desires for more important causes, learning how to put aside distractions and stay focused on what God wants. I've learned over the years that a key to ministry is knowing which battles are worth fighting, which hills are worth dying on. Sometimes you just have to stay humble and maybe eat crow to not get the recognition, just to take someone yelling at you, someone's anger, even if they may be in the wrong, to take it in the moment. And then later be able to have a conversation when emotions have calmed down. It's not easy, though. Luke tells us that about a time on Jesus' ministry when ministry was coming to a close and his face was set toward Jerusalem. It's a way of saying that Jesus knew what he had to do, and he would not let anything get in the way of his destiny. When a Samaritan village would not receive him, the disciples wanted to know, should we call down fire upon the village and destroy it? Jesus knew, too, that this was a distraction. Whatever frustration or even anger that he may have felt, he put them aside for a greater purpose. Along the way to Jerusalem, he met various people who wanted to follow him. They all had good excuses why they could not drop everything and go. To our ears, the excuses sound reasonable. Burying a father, saying goodbye, plowing a field. Luke is giving us a dramatic picture of the kind of sacrifice and the path of self-control that following Jesus requires. The reality is, each one of us here today is probably struggling with important things and situations that maybe we're not sure how to handle. We know that the way we are dealing with them is draining us of our energy and time and keeping us from doing what we know in our hearts to be the most important. For some, maybe it's an interior struggle of the mind, heart, or spirit. For others, it's an outward pressure, trouble, or demand. The Spirit is here longing to give us the grace we need to manage those things that press upon us, to discipline ourselves, and to practice self-control so that we may lead the life God wants us to lead. We struggle as people to keep our eyes fixed on God. Sometimes those who manifest the gift of self-control, though, can be the most surprising people of all. The Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Robert Coles has studied the social, moral, and spiritual lives of children. In an address he gave at Agnes Scott College, Dr. Coles told of his experience in 1961 with 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, the first black child to integrate into a formerly all-white elementary school in New Orleans. You're probably familiar with the story of how she, under the protection of federal marshals, had to pass each day through an angry mob. Ruby's teacher, Miss Barbara Henry, reported to Dr. Coles that Ruby was cheerful, eager to learn. Her parents said that she slept well and ate well. Well, Dr. Coles replied, she's mustering her strength to deal with the trouble by denying it. He continued that it will eventually wear thin, and then she will be in trouble. The teacher responded, you mean that because Ruby is doing well, she is in trouble? When she starts to have trouble, it'll mean she is better. The doctor replied, yes, that was right. He was wrong. Miss Henry saw Ruby open and close her mouth as she passed through that angry crowd. She asked Ruby to whom she was talking, and Ruby said that she was praying for them because they needed praying for. She prayed, please God, try to forgive these people because they do not know what they are doing. In a dangerous situation with violence and threats all around and harassment, God gave her the strength and the self-control to keep her eyes on Jesus. When I think of self-control, I also remember Jackie Robinson's story. He was the first black player to play in Major League Baseball. He wasn't necessarily the best. You could easily make the case that Josh Gibson or Satchel Paige were better, should have gone to Major League Baseball first. But Jackie had something Major League Baseball and the Dodgers knew he would need to have, knew that the first black player would need in spades. Whether it was unfair or not, it was the reality that he would need self-control, because he would be unfairly and unjustly subject to abuse and ridicule and hate and isolation. And the temptation will be to lash out, to call people out on it constantly, to get angry. And that's what people were just waiting for, wanting it, set him up in that trap. But Jackie's self-control not only helped him have a Hall of Fame career, but also paved the way for generations of future black and Hispanic and Asian ball players, many of them Hall of Famers too. Self-control is not easy. Sometimes it's easier and tempting to just hulk out, to give in to our desires, to lash out and to strike back, to leave the established path for a shortcut. Self-control is hard. Jesus knows. He could have called 10,000 angels to take him off the cross, to destroy those who hurt him. He had all the power in the world, but he chose not to use it to hurt or to even save himself. He chose to use it to save us. We are saved by the love of God, the faithfulness of God, the grace of God, the generosity of God, all of that. But I think we often forget we're saved by the self-control of God too. In a world where we can shoot off a snarky email, make a mean comment with a few taps of our phone, when everything is an instant away, self-control may just be the fruit of the Spirit we and the world need most. And so we come to this table, this communion meal, and we remember that on the same night he was betrayed, Jesus ate with his betrayer. He knew Judas was going to do it. He knew the outcome. He knew he was going to be betrayed. But he stayed on message. And he served and he loved, even when he was right there at the table. Even when we're right there at the table, with betrayal in our hearts, with anger, with hate, Jesus just says, come, eat first. Be received first. We'll deal with everything else later. But come, taste and see that the Lord is good. You're welcome here. All of you, all parts of you are welcome here.